It's with great pleasure that I welcome back Dr. Sean Patel, who's the CEO and founder of Prep Expert, the title sponsor of the College Admissions Process podcast. Sean, you have a special message for the listeners?
Hey, John, I just wanted to mention for all the parents and students who are listening to this great podcast, we have a really special offer only for listeners of the College Admissions Process podcast for Prep Expert. So if your student is going to be taking an online SAT, ACT, PSAT course anytime soon, or is looking for one-on-one tutoring with top 1% tutors, head over to prepexpert.com. We offer live online courses for every college admissions exam. On top of that, we have the best score guarantees, best curriculum, and best instructors in the test prep industry. And just for listeners of the College Admissions Process podcast, you can get 20% off any online SAT or PSAT or ACT course, as well as one-on-one tutoring. So you can get 20% off. Just make sure you use the promo code College Talk. That's one word, College Talk, and you'll get 20% off just for listeners of the College Admissions Process podcast. And I hope you guys can use that to your advantage, save a bunch of money at prepexpert.com.
Thank you so much, Sean. And to everyone out there, once again, that promo code is College Talk. That's one word, College Talk. Thank you all, and best wishes. Welcome to The Cap, where we are here to speak with college reps and other professionals in the field of college admissions to help answer all your questions and guide you through every step of the process. So if you're serious about college admissions, you've come to the right place. Are you ready? Let's talk about it. And now, here's your host, Dr. John Durante. Welcome to The Cap, the College Admissions Process podcast. I am your host, John Durante, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome back Rick Barth, who's the Director of Undergraduate Admissions at Clemson University. Rick, thank you so much for coming back. I can't believe that the last conversation was back in 2023. Time definitely flies when you're having fun, and I'm really looking forward, Rick, to this conversation because there are so many students, particularly from where I'm from, up here in the Northeast, that love Clemson University. So, Rick, welcome back. How you doing today?
Hey, John, thank you so much. I am doing very well. I appreciate it. And I'm looking forward to speaking with you again as well. As you say, time does fly. It's hard to believe that was back in 2023. And as you know, things at Clemson just keep growing and applications keep increasing. And it's a very exciting time to be at Clemson University.
Well, it's definitely an exciting time, and it certainly keeps growing. So, Rick, since that awesome conversation back in 2023, Clemson has again seen continued record application growth. What changes are you noticing in application volume, selectivity, and the overall competitiveness of the applicant pool?
Well, John, we continue to grow year over year as far as the applications. This past year, we're slightly over 65,000 applications for next summer and fall. That's about a 4% increase over last year. And I'm in my fourth cycle now at Clemson, and every year we have seen an increase. We are seeing a stronger academic pull out of state. And in-state, we've really grown our in-state applications. We're about 11,000 in-state applications. We're seeing a bit of the opposite. Our incoming out-of-state profile is down a little bit, but I think that's because Clemson is unique in that we do have a very strong bridge program that we bring in about 1,000 students, and 80% of those are in-state. So I think in-state students are realizing that there is a path for them at Clemson. So we're seeing more in-state students that realizing they do have that opportunity. So I think that's why we're seeing a little bit of a lower profile in-state, but we continue to see an increase in our out-of-state, both our applications and in the strength of the applicant pool itself.
Well, that's terrific. And Rick, as applications increase, how has Clemson's approach to shaping a class evolved? In other words, are you reading differently today than you were even just a few years ago?
We are, John. I want to joke and say we're reading more quickly, but actually what is happening is, you always try to be holistic, but because of the growth in the applications, we're very much hybrid. We're formulaic at the top, meaning that we spend more time looking at, okay, if the student's in the top 5% of their class, they're, 1430 and higher SAT, those type of things, then, we are doing a lot more formulas as far as that automatic admit off the top. And then, same thing at the bottom. Is this student going to be able to succeed at Clemson? And if not, they probably need to start somewhere else. So we're spending more time, with that middle applicant pool as far as the time we spend on those applications. As you are probably aware, we do have students self-report their grades, what used to be called SHRORs, now STARS. And I know that can be frustrating for both families and school counselors that work with their students on doing it. But because of the volume we have and the size of the team, STARS is a very important tool for us as far as how we look at our data and look at students' grades and so forth. So I would say, where we have seen a change is that we spend more time looking at the formulate top of the funnel, more time, with the data provided to us through the self-reported grades, and spending more time in committee with those students that we really have to find that fall path, that summer path, or that bridge path, spending more time in the middle, so to speak. But it's definitely challenging. We probably need to extend and expand our external reader population, and that's something we'll be looking at going into next year, and doing some other things as far as, how do we continue to be able to handle the number of applications we are getting at the moment.
Well, I appreciate you explaining that the students self-report, and families often hear the phrase institutional priorities, and obviously that's one of many priorities that Clemson has. And people hear about that term, institutional priority, but it can also feel very abstract to someone who's not working in admissions.
Sure.
So, Rick, at Clemson, what priorities most influence class shaping right now? And are there priorities applicants rarely consider that actually matter a great deal?
Yes, Clemson's unique in some ways in that we do admit by major. Does not mean that every student has to know exactly what they're doing. We do have an undeclared option on the application in both our College of Business and College of Engineering. They work with students their first year, regardless of which major they choose in the college, to make sure that that's truly what they want to do, and then really get into their major courses their sophomore year. For us, the number one institutional priority is in-state students. We are a state-supported institution. And, the evidence of that, John, is our in-state. We had about 11,000 applications this year, as I mentioned earlier, and we admitted 5,708 students, which is about a 52% acceptance rate to either a fall or summer admit. If you look out of state, we received 53,302 applications and admitted 18,728 with an acceptance rate of 35%. And so, as you know, that's a pretty big difference in acceptance rate. And so our number one priority as far as institutional priorities is our in-state population. Second is by major. Since we do admit by major, we have certain charges as a committee. One of those is it is very challenging to get students that still want to teach. But as you know, there is a nationwide teaching shortage. South Carolina is not exempt from this challenge. So one of our institutional priorities is College of Education and producing teachers. And you say, well, how does this impact that student that's applying to Clemson? Well, if you have a student that is interested in being a teacher and their profile is very similar to a student that wants to be in sports communication, there's a very good chance that sports communication student might be waitlisted where that education student would be admitted. And the two students look at each other and say, why is this? It's institutional priority, because priority on teaching right now. So that's really our two big institutional priorities. And, our largest programs, are in the College of Business and the College of Engineering. They're the colleges that want the most students. So I guess you could also argue then that an institutional priority goes all the way down to the college level and how many students each college wants.
Well, we appreciate that. So, students, if you're looking to major in education, the awesome Clemson University might just
Yes,
be the right fit for
we
you.
want you.
And they definitely
Exactly.
want you, and I appreciate you talking about your in-state and out-of-state numbers, and you're also looking at things such as what is the major that the student is applying for. Now, you also mentioned earlier that you received approximately 65,000 applications. So, in terms of your institutional priority with the number of freshmen that you want to admit, more or less, what is that class size in terms of the incoming class?
This year, our target is 5,050. So it typically ranges between 4,750 to 5,100. Where that number comes from, John, is the university does not want to grow faster than 2% a year. And within that 2% is graduation rate, number of transfer students, but one of the drivers is the first year population. So we look at, how many students are graduating this year, what's the number it's going to take from a first year incoming class standpoint to get to 2%, but not be over 2%. And that's how we base that number. So it kind of stays in that corridor between 4,750 and 5,100.
Well, I appreciate that insight. And again, another institutional priority there is that you're not looking to grow more than 2%, which, by the way, I appreciate that you're looking to grow something each year with more applications. That's something that really is awesome to help serve the many families that absolutely love Clemson University. And so, another thing that a lot of students and their families want to hear about, Rick, in these conversations is just unpackaging the overall application. Now, of course, the transcript is the foundation of the academic review. How does your team evaluate course selection, rigor, grade trends, and alignment with the intended major? And what carries the most weight? And I know that you mentioned earlier that the students self report, but in terms of that review, what carries the most weight?
We try to look and see, has a student truly challenged themselves with their curriculum? That is very doable in state. We know our in state institutions, even our smaller ones, even our homeschool umbrellas very well. So we kind of know what is available to students in state. We know with our primary out of state feeders what's available to students. The admissions committee, the 5 members have over 120 years experience between them. And so, in many cases, it's very easy to understand what opportunities a student has. It's not the case with every school, of course, and that's why the school profile can be very important if schools give us the type of information of what type of curriculum students do have available to them. But what we like to see is students that, continue on track, take 4 years of a math, 4 years of an English, 4 years of a science, and that they are taking those in an order that shows they are continuing to progress into more challenging courses. We do not count the number of AP courses that a student takes. We're not looking for 12 AP classes. If the school has a robust AP program, we would like to see, 4 or 5 AP courses, just being honest with you. If a school has IB and honors, we would like to see some of those courses. For students that are interested in STEM, we want to see the science courses, we want to see the math courses. For students that are interested in engineering, computer science, data science, we want them to get as close to Calculus 1 in high school as they possibly can. And if they take, AP Calculus AB, or they're taking it their senior year and they're reporting that, that's great. That's going to help them get into engineering. The reason for that's very simple. There's a high correlation between students being able to step on a campus and step into Calculus 1 and getting an engineering degree, much more so than a student that has to take a math course or two before they get to the Calculus 1 level. So we want them to step on campus being able to step into Calculus 1 because we know the data shows us that student has a much higher likelihood of graduating than a student that does not do that. So those are the type of things we are looking for. We have what's called a selection index. So everything the committee does, everything the student does, the GPA, the rank. I'll talk about that in a moment because I know most schools don't rank. The test score. If they submit a test, we are test optional, as you know. The grades on the holistic review. We even have, for the schools that we have a long history with, what's called a kicker in the selection index. So schools that have students that do extremely well, meaning they come to Clemson and graduate in 4 years, they actually get a little bit of a boost in that selection index as well. part of that reflects that that school has a very rigorous curriculum. So there's a number of ways we look at that, but we're truly trying to see, did the student challenge themselves with the opportunities they had at that school, and did the course sequence make sense for what they tell us they want to major in?
Well, it all makes a lot of sense. First of all, you're looking at the context of what the student's high school offers. You do that by this thing called a school profile. And we always remind students and families, if you're not familiar with your own school's school profile, definitely go to your counseling office or search for it online. I think it's a good thing to see so that you get a better idea of how you're being evaluated, again, based on the context of your high school. Of course, if you want to go into the engineering major, then obviously having high level math courses can only help you. Now, Rick, you also mentioned the GPA. Could we just unpackage that a little bit? I know that students self report their grades, but in terms of the GPA, are you recalculating? Are you looking only at course subjects? How does it work in terms of the GPA?
We do take the total GPA off the student's transcript, and then we do put it on a 4-point scale. So, we're once the committee get it, everybody is put on a 4.0 scale, and we do weight and unweighted. The STARS report, as long as the data is entered correctly, helps us look at weighted scores, not just this is one. While I understand it's a pain point for a lot of families, one of the positives about self-reported grades is the STARS profile does allow us to slice and dice the data and look at what's the weighted, not just the overall weighted, but the weighted for math, the weighted for English, these type of things that depending on major really helps us do that. I would say in most cases on a 4-point scale, you're looking at an unweighted GPA for a student that has taken 4 years of an English, 4 years of a math, 4 years of a science. We like to see several years of a foreign language if possible. Some students don't have that ability at their schools. Unweighted, we're looking for about a 3.77. Weighted, we're looking about a 4.4.
Fantastic. We appreciate that context. And also, Rick, you mentioned earlier that Clemson continues to remain test optional. Can you share the percentage of students who were admitted that did not submit a test score? And how would you advise a student who is wondering whether or not to submit their standardized test? And this is something that students and parents ask all the time. So I'm really interested in hearing your insights.
We do monitor this very closely because, as you can imagine, we get the question as well. And I will say this, I'm very proud of the last 2 years of our total applicant pool. 40% of the students applied test optional. Of our total admitted pool, we were right at the 40%. I mean, it was right on the nose. 3 years ago, only 30% of our admitted students, even though 40% applied test optional, only 30% of the admits were test optional. And so that did, kind of wake us up a little bit and made sure that, we're paying attention. I will say that the correlation that year, as far as GPA and rank, that correlated much higher with the test submitters than it did with the students that did not submit a test. And I'm not trying to excuse that discrepancy, but, there were other factors involved in that as well. So we do try to make sure that there is not a disconnect between the percent of students getting admitted that were test optional versus test submitters. I think there's very valid reasons not to submit a test. And one of the things I mentioned I would circle back to in our last question that I forgot to, and I apologize, is we do rank. And for students saying, wait a minute, my school doesn't rank, how do you rank? Well, again, it goes back to the school profile that you and I discussed. And a lot of schools will give us, the top 10% is a 3.35 and higher and break down by sometimes it's quartile, sometimes it's, they'll give us as high as the 90th percentile. Sometimes schools don't do that. So that makes it more difficult. So what we do is we have 10 years of data for each school, and we just break down on a standard curve the GPA from those students over the last 10 years, and we create, the students in the top 5%. It means we may have and we break it down to a scale of out of 100, even if the school is larger than 100 graduates. So it means we will have multiple number one students out of their top of the class. And I'm sure especially parents listening are going to say, well, how do you know that your ranking is valid? I send to 4 or 5 independent schools around the country that I know the college counselors very well. I say, "This is the rank we have for your school. Will you send me the real rank?" And they do so. Obviously, I'm not gonna mention the schools because 'cause I'm not sure their headmaster would appreciate them doing that, but they do that for me. And I will tell you, John, every year, again, I'm in my 4th cycle, the Clemson rank is actually more helpful to the students than the actual rank. Meaning if the school has that student as, would have been 4 out of 100, we typically have that student as somewhere between 1 and 3 out of 100. So we're definitely not hurting students by having that rank, but it does allow us to have another data point when a student does not submit the test. So that gets weighted a little bit heavier, that class rank. As far as whether to submit a test or not, I think you and I probably get this question quite a bit, and I don't know if you struggle with it as much as I do because it is a difficult question. You never want to be the decision maker for the family on whether they should submit a test or not. But as you know, John, most schools, somewhere on their website, you can find the SAT middle 50% and the ACT middle 50% scores. As I think we're going to talk about today, also the common data set, you can find it there. And so for Clemson right now, our SAT middle 50% is 1250 to 1400. So what that means is the majority of our students that were admitted fall in between a 1250 and a 1400. 25% of our admits are above a 1400 and 25% are below that 1250. So I always refer families to that. And being a little bit more direct, if you look at that 1200 SAT, that's below our middle 50%. That 1200 submitting it is not going to hurt a student, but John, it's not going to help a student either. So that's kind of my cutoff is saying, if you really look at this, if you're 1200 and above, it's not going to hurt you to submit. ACT, same thing. That 2627 is not going to hurt you. It may not help you, but it's not going to hurt you. If you get below that 26, that 27, and you have a really good academic profile, you've challenged yourself, you have a high GPA, I would go test optional.
Hey, podcast friends, if you've been enjoying the College Admissions Process podcast, I'm excited to share my new book, Straight from the Admissions Office, Insider Strategies for College Applications. It's packed with insights and tips from over 250 podcast episodes with admissions professionals designed to make the college process less overwhelming. Whether you're a student, parent, or college counselor, it's a valuable resource for navigating the admissions process. By grabbing a copy, you're also helping to support the podcast. The links are in the show notes. Thank you, and best wishes to all with the college admissions process.
Well, I appreciate that coming from the Director of Admissions from Clemson University. And one of the things that you mentioned that I want to go back to, because I think it's so important for students and parents to hear, is that how do you rank at Clemson? Well, what you do is you look back at 10 years of data from the student's particular high school, which points to the fact, students and parents, that they are evaluating you based on the context of your high school. So they're able to rank you based on 10 years of data of all the students that have taken that same curriculum and have gone to Clemson. They have that data, and that's how they're able to evaluate you again based on the context of your high school. And I emphasize that because so many families feel that their child is being compared to that school down the road or down the block, and that's just not the case. You're evaluated based on the context of your high school.
Exactly.
My follow-up is someone who I interviewed, by the way, just last week, had a great point in terms of the same question with the whether or not to submit standardized tests. And what she said was, rather than worrying only, you should look at, the college's mid 50%, but maybe what you should also look at is the context of your own high school. If you look at that thing that we mentioned earlier, the school profile, your high school profile also has averages in terms of ACT and SAT scores. And so her advice was to perhaps give that a look as well, so that you're, again, comparing yourself based on the context of your own high school. Rick, what do you think about that? Whether you agree or not, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I think that's excellent, John, because as you say, and I can only speak for Clemson, but it sounds like from what you're hearing from others, they do the same thing. Our final review of the committee is actually called a high school review. And that means we have the main committee, those 5 members that I was telling you about, but then we also break the counselors up into teams of 2 or 3. Everybody, before we release, reviews each high school. It's actually a screen that comes up, and it has all the students ranked within that high school, what the decision was of the committee, and we do that to make sure there's consistency within the high school. So a college counselor, John doesn't get his report and say, "Rick, what are y'all doing? This makes no sense." But we also do it for that same reason you're talking about, is to make sure that, we're looking at those students compared to each other, compared to the opportunities they've had within this school, compared to the test scores within that school. So I'm actually jealous that I didn't think of that. But yes, that is exactly right. That person you interviewed is dead on. You should also be looking at what are the other schools from that score, because we want to admit students from schools that apply to us. So we never want to see a school that has sent us a significant number of applications and we're not admitting any. There's no way, getting back to, your parent concern about, I don't want my child compared to the child at this other school. We cannot make this a purely fair process, but we can help limit things such as grade inflation at some schools versus not at other schools by then evaluating the students at that school with their peers at that school. And so we do that, and that is called our high school review. We do that at the end of the process. That happens typically, we wrap that up anywhere between 48 to 24 hours before we even release. So it's a very stressful process getting it done, but we definitely do that. And so I think that interviewee that you were speaking to last week, I think she makes an excellent point on that.
Well, I really appreciate that. And this has been a phenomenal conversation. But we've been talking a lot about, I think, the quantitative side of the application review. And so, Rick, in today's admissions environment, are essays and other qualitative elements, how are they carrying weight? In other words, can you share what separates a memorable essay from one that simply feels safe?
Yeah, and I think, John, this is where I'm going to step out of the Clemson role for a minute and share my conversations. I speak all around the country on panels at high schools and college fairs, and I have territories that I manage myself with my team just because we are a small team. I know there are a lot of schools, especially the selective, smaller, independent schools, that are putting more and more weight on activities and essays and so forth. And so I do think it's become critically important for students to take those very serious. For Clemson, it comes more into play with our honors program. They require the essay and 2 letters of recommendation. And then for the committee, since we get 90% of our apps come in through the Common App, we have the essays. So for the committee, that essay can play a role where we have the 3 paths to Clemson: the fall admit, the summer admit, or the bridge. If the committee is really torn or split on a student between whether they're going to be a fall admit or a summer admit, that's when you'll have committee members that'll start digging deeper into the activities and the essays and so forth. But they definitely need to take it very serious, the essay, if they're interested in the Clemson Honors College. To me, I think a lot of times students overthink the essay. And, I don't wish trauma on anyone. And I think a lot of times a 16, 17, 18-year-old thinks they've had to have some type of tremendous trauma in their life to write a really good essay. And I wish that on no one that young. So I really hope they're not able to write that essay, to be honest with you. Kind of what we're looking for is something that reveals their unique personality or the way they think, or events in their life that led them to have an academic interest that they have. I've shared with you a similar story, and this is a different one, but a similar story of, this young woman wrote, about the impact her uncle had on her and just in his stamp collecting, and started her with him collecting stamps when she was very young. And it just really showed her matching the stamps of different countries, then reading about the countries, reading about their leaders, things that had happened in the world before she was born and just became fascinated with history and specifically world history. And that led to her interest in being, a history major and eventually wanting to be a professor of history. So it was something as basic as stamp collecting that she learned early from a relative and was able to share, this is how I developed my academic interests. So, I think that's important that they really show something that's uniquely personal and so forth. I'd much rather see a student talking about, this is what I learned when I became a supporting actress in a school play when I thought I should be the lead versus a story about an athletic accomplishment or something like that. Some self-reflection with the event, not just the event itself. And I think sometimes students think they have to have a traumatic event in their life or they had to win some type of Division 6A title in a sport or something. And it really doesn't have to be that complicated. I don't want students to stress over the essay. And even for the students that are really competing at the Ivy level and so forth, I would give the same advice. I've helped many families write essays that were going to the Ivies and so forth. And it's the same thing. It's one part of that application. Keep it simple, share something that the committee cannot find anywhere else on the application, but show a little bit about what makes you unique or why you have the interest that you have.
Well, I think that's great. And I love the example you gave about stamp collecting. This person talked about something that happened in her family, which led her to want to pursue her career. And I also appreciate you saying how it doesn't have to be something traumatic. Hopefully, we don't have anything traumatic in our lives at the age of 17, which leads me to the next question about the additional information section of the Common Application, which a lot of times students use that just for that reason if something traumatic did happen. And hopefully it didn't, but I get it if you have to use that information to give context about that. But Rick, have you seen other unique ways that students have used the additional information section in a way where they're looking at their overall application, they're seeing that something is missing? Perhaps there was a dip in grades in 10th grade and they wanted to give some context. Can you share how else students use that additional information section, which really helps their overall application?
Yeah, John, I think you hit on exactly when they should use it in primarily two categories. Academic context, explaining an odd dip in grades if they're not able to address it elsewhere, and extenuating circumstances. And how I see those differing is, that academic context. And you do see that. I remember my first year here being at other places before being at Clemson that were, I won't say open admissions, but were not near as competitive as Clemson. Something I wouldn't have noticed elsewhere was this student had made all A's, ninth grade, 10th grade, and then made all B's first semester of her junior year. And so she used that space, from a standpoint of, I understand my grades dropped. My parents were going to a divorce at this period. I really, took me a few months to get over that and get myself back together. And I think, a lot of times, students are told, don't write about, the 3 Ds in your essay, divorce being one of them. Well, if they're not comfortable, and I don't necessarily agree with that advice, but if they're not comfortable writing about that, then that's the space to put it because you can do it in a very concise, straightforward way and, not get into the intimate details of it, but still get the message across. Because as, I sit in with the committee quite a bit. I make decisions with them, but I am not part of the committee because I have other responsibilities. When they meet, it's weeks on time, 7 in the morning to 7 at night. And I have other things I have to do as director, but I sit with them as much as I can. And to me, that's very helpful if I see that type of dip in grades of, I appreciated that young woman sharing that with us. And then, of course, extenuating circumstances can be something where it impacts that individual. It might not be, outward facing like a parent divorce, but it's, long-term illness, serious illness, car wreck that led to an illness or an injury, I'm sorry, those type of things that really impacted maybe a year of that student's school and so forth. So I do think those are the two, I think you hit it. Those are the two areas that I think that's the most helpful. I don't think it's a space to be dramatic or repetitive. And I think sometimes students think they have to put something in there, and there's nothing wrong with leaving it blank.
Well, we appreciate the examples and the context shared. And another part of the overall application is the activity section, which is an important part, right? Because
Yep.
you get to see what students chose to do when they were not in class, but they only get 150 characters per activity on the Common Application. So, Rick, what makes an activity description stand out in such a limited space? And can you share an example of how a student used that constraint effectively?
What I always look for is, what did the student actually do? And did they have a long-term investment in an activity versus, a one-off? And does it show something about who they are becoming or, why they have the interest that they have, academically? And, sometimes you'll see things where the student's being very concise and it can be very powerful. It's like, spent 2 years raising $10,000 for a local literacy nonprofit can be much more powerful, although almost identical as far as length than, member of Key Club. And I think that's sometimes where students, miss. You can be very concise and talk about an outcome and the length of time that you participated without being too wordy and being able to fit into those 150 characters, but at the same time giving us more information than just saying, I was the member of a Key Club. I was looking for some of the examples I'd seen over the years, and something that really sticks out to me is when a student creates something. So a student created peer tutoring program and schedule used by 40 students weekly with difficulties in math or something like that. And I was trying to remember exactly how the student put it in my notes, but it was just so neat the way that she talked about what she did, how long she did it, and what the outcome was. And I thought that was very interesting. I also think sometimes students think, a part-time job is not an activity that a committee wants to see. I would rather see someone worked a 15-hour job than, again, telling me that you were in 15 clubs and not telling me that you were an officer or showing any leadership from those clubs. So someone that says, I worked at a family restaurant, onboarding new employees and taking inventory, that blows me away, that much more so than telling me that, you were a member of multiple clubs, if that makes any sense. And so, one of the examples I thought about was, we did have a student who had a family restaurant and he wrote about managing inventory and onboarding employees from the time he was 15 at this restaurant. And I was thinking, knowing how hard it is to onboard employees, wow, that's pretty impressive that, that his parents allowed him to serve the family restaurant in this way. And what an excellent learning opportunity for him.
Definitely an excellent learning opportunity and absolutely something that comes up a lot in the podcast episode where students are working, but for whatever reason, they decide not to include it.
Yep.
And their activity section probably does not look that robust because they're working, they're not including the job. And so it leaves you as an admissions director to speculate as to why. And students, whenever someone in admissions has to speculate as to why, usually that's not going to work out in your favor. So you have to give a comprehensive overview of what it is that you're doing outside by using that activity sheet. If you have a job, list it.
Yep.
If you're in different clubs, certainly list them and try to explain the context of each the best that you can. I love the example that you shared about the peer tutoring because many times students that I speak to feel that, oh, I have to have a leadership role. I have to be the president. I have to be this. I have to be that.
Yeah.
Sometimes you can create your own leadership. And what I mean by that is, for example, if you happen to be a soccer player, right? And maybe you're not the captain of the team, but you decided that within your club, you're going to create tutoring for the younger players in that club, right? If that's something that you initiated and you're taking the responsibility of putting that together and you're showing initiative and you're frankly leaving the club better than when you found it by offering this new peer tutoring opportunity for all of the students, That is tremendous leadership. That's tremendous initiative. And that's something that students you can do without necessarily being the captain of the team or the president of the club. So use these as examples, perhaps, to do something and leave whatever activity you're in better than how you found it. Now, Rick, what do strong letters of recommendations consistently do well? And what makes a letter less helpful even when it's positive?
Yeah, John, and this obviously, again, like the essay, I know this is a question you get quite a bit. And if you're like other college counselors I work with, struggle with quite a bit. And first of all, I hate the demand it puts on y'all's time, from the counseling standpoint, because I don't need 2 pages. I need to know that you know the student's got good character, and the student will work hard when they get to college. Those are the 3 things I need to know. Typically, like our honors program, we ask for a letter of recommendation from a college counselor and a letter of recommendation from a teacher. We had to do that because sometimes we're getting letters of recommendation from a parent. Strongly advise parents do not write the letter of recommendation for their child. Don't mean that ugly. I just strongly advise that they not do that. The other thing is you will get letters from teachers that did not have the student in class. That's not helping the student. The student needs to get to know a teacher well enough to feel comfortable asking them to write a letter of recommendation. I cannot tell you how many times I've read a letter from a teacher saying, I know John from church. He's a great baseball player. And then they will actually write in the letter, I've never had him in class, and that doesn't do us any good. So make sure the letter does not have to be 2 pages. Actually, we prefer it not be over a page because we've got to read them too. It needs to show that the writer knows the student, that the writer feels like this is a person of strong character. And it's not so much what the student has done academically, that's important, but moving forward, that this student does have the work ethic to succeed at college, at Clemson. Those are the 3 things we really want to understand about the student.
Well, that's great insight. And earlier we did mention the common data set. Families often overlook using the common data set because in many cases they frankly don't even know what it is.
Right.
So, Rick, how would you advise families to use Clemson's common data set wisely, and what should they avoid overinterpreting?
Well, I think the most important thing is the common data set. It's not a marketing tool. Most people at a university assume families are not going to read it. So it gives you a much more transparent view of what is going on at that institution. We'll show you how selective a school is just by the way they accept data from us. Then they do the figuring of it. It'll show you an overview of what factors matter in admissions. We'll show you how generous the school is with financial aid. And to me, the most important part is how do students fare once they are enrolled at the institution? So it will show you data on retention, graduation, and of course, the class sizes at the university. And so I can have a representative out on the field telling you this is the class size. If you want to check that for yourself, you can go to the common data set. And a data person at the university has been reporting that's not out there speaking to a family. So they're going to give you the actual information, on the class size. And so I do think that's critically important. Parents ask me all the time, because I'm not a big fan of like US News and so forth, because it's just hard to numerically rank a university. That makes no sense to me, And so I always have parents when I tell them that, well, what should we use? I think you need to look at that retention rate, that progression rate, and that graduation rate, And then I get in trouble because, I'm proud of Clemson's. Our 6-year graduation rate's bumping up against 90%. And parents look at me like, you mean you have 10% of your students that don't graduate? It's like the national average for 6-year graduation rate. You probably know this better than I do, John, is like 61, 62%, So
Far lower than 90% for
um,
sure.
yeah, more than 90%. So, I think it's also important to interpret the data, which in the context of those type of things, but I do think it's and the other thing you can do with the common data set that families don't often think about, you have common data set of any university you want. You can go to their website and pull it. So you can do an Excel spreadsheet and you can just compare schools right next to each other. And I think that can, be very helpful, much more beneficial than using one of the, media's rankings of universities.
Yeah, we appreciate that insight. And I also like that you mentioned the retention rate, which basically is the percentage of students that return after that first year. So that's something also that many families don't necessarily know about. And I think it's helpful just in terms of determining the type of community that are at the different colleges. And of course, today we're talking about the wonderful Clemson University. Now, Rick, for students that may have had an IEP or a 504 plan while they were in high school, what support system does Clemson offer to ensure continued success once they're on your campus?
Do appreciate you asking about this, John, because as you know, it does change at the high school level with the IEP. It's all about support and working with families, and it's a much more, you don't really even, you do have to raise your hand to an extent, but the schools can ask, they can publicize. At college it's a little bit different. We are not even allowed to put on an application, would you like to be considered, would you like a disability considered, and so forth. Back in the 90s we were able to kind of put that on the application, is there a disability you would like considered, learning disability, other disability considered for admissions purposes. We cannot do that anymore. And so I do think it's very important that students understand they have to self-identify, at Clemson or at any university when they come. And what we call it is our Student Accessibility Services Office. Different universities have different names for it. Sometimes it's called the Disability Resource Center. A lot of schools have shifted that language to Student Accessibility Services. And this is the office that you need to find on the website of the university or college you're attending, because you have got to self-identify. Once you self-identify, they will ask for the documentation typically before you start. So I would, as soon as you're admitted somewhere, I'd reach out to that office. Most websites will show you exactly what they want, how you contact them, and then they will work with you as far as making sure your faculty are contacted, as far as, what extended test time, any of the accommodations that your documentation tells you that you are allowed to have. I have ran disability services back in the day when we called them that at the University of West Florida. I have worked with these offices very closely everywhere I've been, so I'm not just saying this, John. We have an amazing group of people that do this at Clemson University. Our director, Margaret Camp, I've probably been around Margaret a handful of times, and I get more impressed every time I'm around her. What I really like about them is they're very responsive. Their website is very clear, so students and families know exactly what they're doing. And they also tie students into the general community. So yes, they will reach out to faculty about the accommodation and what the faculty member needs to do, so it takes the burden off the student, and that's great. But they also let their students know about, the academic advising, the tutoring, everything that any student has access to. They make sure their students are tied into all those student support services as well. And I think that's outstanding. I've worked at a number of these universities and areas where the accessibility services just focused on what they do for students. And what I really appreciate about Margaret and her team is, yes, they do a very good job of that, but they also challenge their students to use all resources across campus. And I think that's very powerful for the students.
Well, a big shout out again to Margaret and her team. We really appreciate that comprehensive answer. And Rick, if there are any links that you want to share, send them to me. And of course, we'll make them available to all the listeners in the show notes. And as a follow up, a question many families wrestle with is whether a student should disclose a learning difference during the application process itself, or should they wait until after they're admitted? How would you guide a family if they ask you this question, Rick?
Yeah, and it's a great question, but a very complicated question. I would say if the family wants it to be, or the student wants it to be considered by the admissions committee, they need to put it in the application. Obviously, we've talked about some areas they can put it in the additional information session. They can put it in the essay. I've had students and families that have written me a separate letter from the application explaining the disability, the challenge it has created, and would it please be considered in the application process. That gets a little iffy on legal grounds, so I'd prefer it be in the application. So that can be one way to get it out front if if you want the committee to consider it in the decision itself. What the law requires is accommodation after notification and documentation. So the law does not require that student to be given any special consideration. It also does not ban that student from getting special consideration if the committee chooses to make that part of their review process. So if a family does not identify, as having a disability during the admissions process, once they get admitted, obviously, the best thing they will, within our communication plan, they will get a communication. Everybody will at some point about student accessibility services, but they can obviously find that website on their own and get the process started that way. I think sometimes if a student gets a decision they do not like, they would like to appeal based on the disability. And so we do have an appeal process for students that are denied the appeal. I'm just going to be honest, John, it's very hard to get through our appellate committee and get that decision changed, but it does happen. And so, the student can write about, I feel like my GPA was lower because I did not have the accommodations I needed at the high school, and then give examples of that. And so, you will see that occasionally as well. But I think those are the different avenues that families have to get that information across to us. I just really want families to understand it's not that we don't care. We're just legally not allowed to ask on the application.
Well, we really appreciate those insights, Rick. And after years leading admissions at Clemson, and I know that you worked at other institutions prior, what's one question you wish more families would ask about but rarely do?
Well, and I think with Clemson, in the spotlight we have on us with, as you say, so many students coming to us from all over now, and especially from your area, is one question I'm really surprised that I never get is, how does Clemson's Career Center help students build connections and find opportunities, beyond South Carolina? Because I know that's got to be concern of some families. And, when you gave me this question, it really made me think, what's the one thing that surprises me? And I am surprised I don't get more questions in this realm and about what we do as far as helping students, get that first job out. I think sometimes there's a perception that because we're located in a college town in South Carolina, most of our professional connections are in this region. Clemson's Career Center has relationships with employers across the entire country. We just had a career fair the other day, and I was just stunned with the recruiters from companies from all over the country. The license plate, they're in the same building with us. The license plate out there in our parking lot. Our alumni, I think we talked about this last time, John. Our alumni are second to none as far as networking in major cities, and they truly care about our students and our graduates. Career Center is always highly ranked, and I really just encourage families, to talk to their sons and daughters that are coming to Clemson and get involved in the Career Center day one of their freshman year, because it's not just about job placement. It's about professional development. It's about career coaching. It's about resume development. And, the more you have working with an advisor from your first year, by the time you start writing that resume, toward the end of your junior year, beginning of your senior year, the stronger it's going to be if you've had that coaching along the way and you've had somebody really walk in that path with you. And so since we are getting more and more applications out of state, I just wish that was one question I got more about, how are you going to help my child as far as being back in California, being back in New York, so they truly understand the networks that we have both through the Career Center and through our alumni network.
Well, I'm so glad I asked that question, and I thought that was just a tremendous answer. And it really points to the fact, students, that you have to advocate for yourselves, right? There's a career center. It's fantastic, alumni network. But if you don't go there and advocate for yourself and get involved with it, then it's meaningless, right? So whether it's going to the accessibility center because you have a learning disability, or because you want to go to the career center to network, to meet alumni, to perhaps get an internship, you again have to really advocate for yourselves. And so, Rick, I really appreciate that question. This has been a phenomenal conversation. Before I get to the last question, I always like to ask, is there a question that I didn't ask you today that you wish I had? Or perhaps a topic that just didn't come up in the conversation that you'd like to share with us now?
Yeah, John. As we continue to get more competitive, more selective as an institution, I get more and more pushback, mainly from parents saying, you destroyed my child's dream, or, you ruined this, all this kind of stuff. And I never get asked, is there a path for me if I get denied, when I apply to Clemson? And there's an easy path. It's called transferring. And, it's basically taking a fall and spring term at another institution, often a 2-year institution, making decent grades, making sure you are taking academic classes and not weightlifting, and getting the 30 hours and transferring them in. And quite honestly, it's a much less competitive path than first year admissions. So that's the one thing that I do want to highlight is there an alternative path once you get denied from Clemson? Yes. And you know this, John. There is a path that a lot of times families don't think about. And while they are disappointed that their child did not get admitted to Clemson right away, we really are only asking them to go do transfer work for 1 year, one fall and spring semester, take 15 academic hours, and you can come in your sophomore year as a transfer student. It's really not a difficult path.
Well, I think that's great advice. And coincidentally, I did a series of episodes last summer where I interviewed students, and the criteria was that they had to have at least 1 year of college complete so that they could come on the podcast and talk about their experience going through the admissions process as a high schooler. And more than half of them were actual transfer students. And it was a great conversation hearing about their journey in high school, what they would have done differently, and how excited they were to transfer into, at the time of the podcast episode, what they thought was, their number one choice. So, of course, we wish them well and all of the other students out there well with their families. And Rick, unfortunately, this does lead us to our last question, which always is, what are your top 3 pieces of advice? And you've given so many pieces of advice already, Rick, but what are your top 3 for students and families going through the college admissions process?
Yeah, I think the first one is, start the family discussions about college early. Sophomore year, a simple conversation between the parent and the child about the student's interest, both academically and what colleges they are starting to think that they might like to attend, and then continue that conversation through the junior year, but start being more specific and more open and transparent with each other, and for parents to be honest about their concerns and barriers. If you know you're in a situation where you're not going to allow your child to go out of state, then have that conversation. Have it early in their junior year. If there are financial restrictions, have that conversation as well. One story I always share is, we've got a good friend of the family who, she had a brilliant daughter, and daughter got into Yale. And mom and dad were like, we can't afford it. You're not going. It's like, well, why did you let her apply? You know? And so just have those conversations early. I don't think it's healthy to talk about the college selection process every day. So I think that just makes it stressful. So maybe even set up some time once you do get to the junior year of saying, okay, we're not going to talk about this every day, or early in the senior year when you're waiting to make the decisions, but just talking about what are the options. And then the second piece is definitely related to that, and that's do your research on your top choices and do not set unrealistic expectations. And my favorite story along this lines is my first year at Clemson. And again, I'd come from places that were not nearly as selective as Clemson is at the moment. But even I knew this. I'm sitting at lunch with a really good high school with some very bright students. And so we're having lunch. I'm talking about Clemson. I start asking them, where they're interested in going, their top choices. It's very early, it was before anybody got out there early decisions or early action decisions or anything. And so these are students very beginning of their senior year. And this young man, is telling me, he's interested. He names a couple of the Ivy schools. And then he says, and this is in Georgia. Keep in mind, I'm in Georgia. I'm not in Virginia. And the young man says to me, and my backup school is UVA. I'm saying, like, UVA out of state is nobody's backup school. Nobody. I don't care how strong your profile is. And so that was an unrealistic expectation. So just make sure that you understand, your top choice, is it obtainable, and understand, what are your chances? And you can find that out very easily by the website, by speaking to the recruiter for your territory from that school, like you said, with the common data set. There's several ways, talking to your college counselor. There's several ways. So just make sure you do your research on your top choices and don't set yourself up for being disappointed by having, unrealistic expectations. There is nothing wrong with taking your shot. I don't mean that at all. If you want to be at UVA and you're out of state resident Georgia, go for it. But just don't think that's your backup school, because then you're just setting yourself up for disappointment. And then third, and most important in my mind, having been somewhere now in my fourth cycle of seeing families get very hurt when they do not get into Clemson, is understand that what you put into college is much more important than the name on the diploma. I would really recommend that every student and every parent of a student that is looking at highly selective institutions read Frank Bruni's book, Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be, An Antidote to the College Admissions Mania. Frank does a great job of laying out the data of just tremendously successful professionals in every field you can think about, coming from, just middle of the road state institutions, small privates you've never heard of, and so forth. And I think that's critically important for families to understand, that it's truly how you engage both academically and socially. Building networks while you're in college is much more important than where you actually go.
Such great advice. Truly tremendous advice, Rick. Obviously, Clemson is so lucky to have you as their director, and we were so lucky to have you on this episode. I'm looking forward to having you back again for episode 3 with Clemson. Rick, you were awesome. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John. I enjoyed it. Appreciate it.
The pleasure was all ours. And to everyone out there, good luck with the college search. Take care all, and best wishes.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of The CAP, the College Admissions Process Podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please don't forget to tell a friend and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and wherever you listen to your podcasts. I am your host, John Durante, and I look forward to seeing you on the next episode of The CAP. Thank you for listening to the College Admissions Process Podcast presented by Prep Expert. Prep Expert offers live online SAT and ACT courses with the best score guarantees, instructors, and curriculum. Go to prepexpert.com to guarantee your child's success.